Dr. Hart, do you want to add anything?
I think the only thing I would add to that is that when we're doing procurement, it helps to quantify sort of how the value is different between renewable resources, and that will help us make good decisions. And I think that's sort of ongoing work at the CPUC. So I think that's important work. And should continue. But
yeah,
because we don't just have, these things aren't just going to show up because there isn't a pure market there. There's value adders and at least cost best fit, and so
we are operating within a regulated industry, and so there is still this role that regulation plays. But both the carbon price, the RPS procurement prices, and the market prices can tell us a lot about the relative value of these different resources, and I think we should use that information as much as we can.
Dr. Hart, could you put on the graph that you had that showed all the different sources of energy, and then going to 50% renewables, how the solar, thank you, Taylor, how the solar stuck out?
Oh, yeah.
So this one?
This one, yes.
All right, yes.
So do you have any kind of a laser pointer?
I do, but it's faint.
Okay, that's good enough.
All
right, so let's look at 50%. What's the blue on the bottom?
This is hydro.
That's hydro.
Small hydro, though.
That's large. That's large hydro.
That's all hydro.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it includes both.
And then the black one just above it.
Let's see if I can read this.
It looks black to me. Maybe it's another.
That's our sort of peaking gas plants. So you see here that they go up. The dispatch from these types of units goes up a bit in those sort of shoulder hours, the same hours where we saw the prices increasing in Dr. Bushnell's slide.
Brownish color right above it.
That's our CCGT fleet. So these are the more efficient natural gas plants that typically run more base load, but we see them ramping up and down throughout the day on these cases.
And there's sort of a light aqua during the day.
This one here?
Yeah.
That is customer PV in this case. So this is actually behind the meter solar that the operator wouldn't see.
All right, and then the green is?
That's all of the renewables. So that includes wind, solar, biomass, geothermal. I think that's it. Small hydro. Actually, small hydro is probably included in that block, not in the hydro block.
And that's all, and that's for 33% renewables. And then you're adding on to that enough solar to get up to the 50%. So just to go through there then, one way to reach this is to have, if you can have more gas peaker plants, that certainly helps. But it's not an easy problem, and there's certainly geographical diversity can help, but again, it's not easy. I think that's sort of the takeaway. Assemblymember Obernolte.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had a couple of questions. First, for Dr. Hart. You were talking about regional coordination, and I heard you say that there were 3 different categories that regional coordination helps with. So we've got load shifting, where we've got different loads in different parts of the country. We've got integration of different resource types, where we might be able to substitute renewable energy where we might have to curtail here for maybe conventionally powered power plants in other parts of the West. And then the third was the climatological differences, where it might be cloudy here and sunny somewhere else, or the wind might be blowing. So, but as Dr. Quirk pointed out, the load differences are only about an hour if we're talking about Western regional coordination. And talking about the different integration of different resource types, I would imagine that most of the Western states, even though they're behind us now, they're going to be catching up. So I would think that particular advantage of regional coordination goes away after a few years, doesn't it? As more and more renewables come online there, and they have exactly the same problem that we have.
Yeah, this is something that I think that is sort of currently under investigation. And one of the reasons we don't have a clear answer on this yet is that those policies aren't in place yet, and they're just not as far along in the other Western states. But we've looked at some scenarios where you have expansion of wind in the Northwest, expansion of solar in the Southwest, and it looks to us like the big question is how much of the coal throughout the rest of the West can you shut down to integrate those sort of resources locally, and is there any room left to take our power in those situations? So it's true, if we're trying to push our excess solar out to the Southwest, and they've already built a bunch of solar as well, and they're in potential overgeneration conditions that it might not be available. But we are pretty far ahead of them. I haven't seen any scenarios where any time in the next 5 to 10 years, they've got anywhere near the amount of solar that we've got in our system. So that said, the solar industry has surprised us, as Dr. Bushnell mentioned. So I don't want to call that a forecast, just that we haven't studied a case where that has been binding yet. We have studied some cases where in the Northwest there's enough wind development up there that they're not often in a position to accept our power in the spring, particularly when they have high hydro conditions. And so it's looking like the interactions with the Southwest and a lot of the coal states is going to be key.
Okay.
All right.
I'm sorry.
Well, we're going to move to the next panel. If you have sort of a short question, go ahead.
I'll ask a short one. This is for Dr. Bushnell. Dr. Quirk had asked a question about doing an apples-to-apples comparison between the cost of renewable energy generation and the cost of traditional energy generation. And you were talking about avoided costs, and I was wondering where we would see the cost of premature retirement of a conventionally powered plant, because you were making the point that wouldn't necessarily show up in a strict comparison of the price of the energy generated. Where would we see that? Is it in rates because those are owned by utility companies, or where would that show up, that cost?
To some extent, it's not in rates because a lot of the thermal fleet is not owned by utilities. They were under long-term contracts that are not. And now are looking for customers, essentially. And there are thermal plants that are threatening to pack up their turbines and move to other states. And this has created some concern in the reliability kind of side of things that we might need these guys, at least for standby purposes, to manage intermittency. And so it's not necessarily being carried by the ratepayers. However, they are willing to sell energy at quite low prices right now because they are sort of looking for markets. And so in that sense, as an alternative source of just energy, ignoring the environmental stuff, they look pretty attractive to deal with. But in terms of just a straight sort of sunk cost or stranded cost, it's largely borne by the private side of things rather than the utilities.
All right, thank you. We'll bring up the next panel, and I think they'll be able to talk about the approach to solving this issue as well. So I think you've already heard what everyone's concerned about. So when you make your presentations, please particularly address that issue, which is how do we balance out load and generation. With two speakers here are Phil Pettengill, Director of Regional Integration at the California Independent System Operator. That's the organization that determines when plants come online and when they're dispatching power, and it also runs the market where it determines price, and it has a capacity market, et cetera, et cetera. And so hopefully he will be able to discuss what we've just heard. And then Mr. Ed Randolph, who's the Director of the Energy Division of the California Public Utilities Commission. So who would like to start first? All right. Phil, and please correct my pronunciation of your last name.
I think you had it right, Mr. Chairman. Phil Pettengill, Director for Regional Integration at the ISO, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I did want to thank you for stealing about half of my thunder. You boiled it down to the two key issues: overgen and flexibility, and you've heard flexibility already in some of the previous speakers. So I wanted to just take the opportunity today to highlight for all of you sort of where we get to those issues. And so I'd start with the graphic that many of us have seen. Many of you probably have seen this, but I wanted to make sure we just sort of use the duck diagram to sort of do a little bit of level setting. And first of all,
so if you're not used to this, that's a duck.
That is a duck. We look at the head of the duck on the right-hand side and the tail of the duck on the left-hand side. And what we're really reflecting here is the back is looking at what was happening in 2013. And you heard Dr. Bushnell going back to 2013, and that's a good place for all of us to start. But what we've done here is we've actually projected, as we add all of the solar resources to the system, that load that was relatively flat during the middle of the day, this is during the month of March, continues to get lower and lower and lower. And what
All right, so I think you need to define what you mean by load here, because it is the load minus well, why don't you define it?
Yeah, and where I was going, thank you, Mr. Chair, is the first drawing is showing the load. But then as we subtract the renewables from that,
Which
we get
is
to
the
the
first
net.
drawing?
Yeah. If I point here,
Good.
2012 was the actual load. 2013 was relatively flat through the middle of the year. And then you see what happens at 2014, 15, and all the way through 2020. What we're simply doing is subtracting the output of the renewables from this. And so, for example, Dr. Bushnell showed what happens with the influx of solar.
So
and that's
just,
why what we see
just
is
to put
this
it
net
another
load.
way, this is the load that's done primarily by natural gas.
No.
No.
The load is our consumption.
Right.
Within
but
the
you're subtracting the renewables from that. So
Yes.
this would be what you're left with is conventional fuels, particularly natural gas.
What we're left with is the operational challenge that we, the ISO, have because of the success of our renewables. And that is the 2 points that we've already identified. The overgen risk is as we get to the middle of the day, the net load is so low that if we have enough other resources online, for example, nuclear resources, hydro, geothermal, other resources that would be building up and typically running throughout the middle of the day, we run the risk that we're in an overgen condition. Too many resources are running when we only have this minimum net load to serve. Our next challenge then in why we talk about flexible is how do we go from the middle of the day now all the way up to serve the peak load that is around 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening on a day like this. And as Dr. Bushnell was pointing out, and so was Dr. Hart, this becomes a challenge for us because we need to have flexible resources that can move fast enough over those hours that take us from the middle of the day to the peak load here in the early evening. If I move to the next slide, thank you, Mr. Chair. You mentioned 822. What we've done is some analysis here. And participating in the PUC's long-term procurement proceeding, we produced some analysis last year before we knew that our new goal was going to be 50%. And what we identified here is under a 40% RPS, there is a risk. 822 events is what you see here where we potentially have to curtail the renewables we have on the system. Clearly, what happens if we move to a 50% RPS business as usual, we get substantially more number of events where we would have to curtail in order to meet reliability criteria. What I wanted to share with you here is this set of solutions is certainly not comprehensive, but it starts to highlight the severity of the challenge here. And what I wanted to point out is if you look in the months of March and April, we've got almost 13,000 megawatts of renewables that will need to be curtailed, at least some portion of an hour. At this time, we're projecting to have about 23 or 24,000 megawatts on the system. So more than half of the renewables will be curtailed off for those events. That becomes a challenge. What we're suggesting here is the solution set is probably most of, if not all of, these things in order to deal with that, just because of the size and scope of this level of curtailment. So let me take just a couple of them and highlight them. You already had a good discussion around storage. Certainly storage is an opportunity to go after that duck diagram in two ways. Can we increase the load in the middle of the day and put the duck on a diet? And can we turn around and serve that load later in the day and bring the head of the duct down? Storage gives us an opportunity to work both ends all within the same 24-hour period. Okay? Another
Yeah, please do.
Sure.
So my question would be, if in fact you had reasonably priced storage, the amount of the excess energy, like I use your app, which I love, the CalISO app, by the way. It shows everything very simply for those of us who are not geniuses. My question would be, that excess energy, how much would it be, or how much would you be able to store, and how long would that storage, I assume it would ramp up in ample time, but would it be enough energy saved to curtail the head of the duct?
Well, that's why
Or to be used.
I think it's a fair question. That's why I suggest that really the solution is a diversified set of procurement that probably goes across all of these options. I don't think we can really say that storage is necessarily going to be the single silver bullet solution. It's going to be a mixture of all those. And so the reality of it is some storage is probably cost effective and very helpful. And we ought to look at adding some more storage. But we also ought to be looking at these other things to help solve the problem. And one of the things I wanted to point to is the next one here is retrofitting existing power plants. We already have a fair amount of gas facilities on the system, and we'll need those just to help fill in for intermittency and the normal dispatch that we are working with during the course of the day. But that doesn't mean we can't take those facilities and actually start to make low-cost investments to increase their ability to provide flexible capacity. Either shut off during the middle of the day or lower their minimum operating level. There's certainly low-cost investments that could be done to sort of upgrade and modify our existing fleet. So there's a series of other things here, but
before you move on to
Yeah.
the other solutions, I wanted to ask a question on the last slide, because this is a slide you guys put out there a lot. I think people walk away with it with maybe a inaccurate impression, because what you don't talk about by putting out this slide is that we don't just have overgeneration and renewables. We don't just have renewables that we're paying for and not using during the spring, but that we have gas that we're paying for and not using too. And so what my point is why wouldn't you characterize this as an overgeneration of all of our resources? You kind of pin it all on renewables here. And I mean, when a gas-fired generator in another balancing area, such as Arizona, schedules into the CalISO in the day-ahead market, you guys treat that as a must-take resource, meaning they treat it as something we have to pay for, whether or not we need it, and you curtail the renewables rather than the natural gas that we didn't need either. You know, it'd be really good to put that out there as part of the problem to solve. And, you know, and if we're, you know, if we've got gas generation online and generating because of self-scheduling or other non-economic behavior in the middle of the day when that exacerbates this overgeneration, why can't we also make steps to make sure that we're curtailing that, not wasting that gas or not wasting our money in the middle of the day instead of taking advantage of the solar that we're already paying for?
Yeah. Thank you. Let me try to address that. That's why it was so important to start with the definition of this. This curve is really the load that the ISO needs to operate against. And so, as you mentioned, and the issue here in the overgen that we're trying to identify is not in any way trying to be technology specific. The ISO is always technology neutral. What we're trying to identify is really what is the challenge as we take the next step forward, moving towards a 50% goal. Because in our view, the 50% is just the new floor, taking us in a direction to even more renewables. Our challenge then is how do we modify the fleet? And so, Assemblyman Williams, what I wanted to do is point out this. First of all, a gas unit trying to sell into California would not clear the ISO market unless we found a need for it. We're not required to take it unless what we saw is a need for additional energy to serve California customers. The second piece I wanted to share with you is that in terms of the resources that are inside the state and potentially running, there's a significant change afoot, and we're not done with that yet. We take, for example, what's going on in Southern California. The once-through cooling policy is going to affect over 6,000 megawatts of resources. And those resources are going to have to become compliant with that once-through cooling policy by the year 2020. So literally in the next 5 years, we're going to have either the shutdown or the repowering of generation. And given the studies that we've already done, it looks like only about half of those resources will be replaced. And when they are replaced, they're going to be replaced with gas units that can help us meet these requirements, but more importantly, they're flexible. They can start and stop multiple times during the day. They can ramp quickly, and or they may have a much lower minimum operating level to help create some headroom here in this overgen condition.
So let me translate. So that with less ramp-up time, these new units will not cause us to have to pay for 24 hours of gas generation that we don't need.
That's correct.
So right now they're just being used for stability. Is
Yes.
that it? Okay.
Yeah.
But the problem is the in-state resources are so old that we have to pay for 23 hours that we don't need
So
to
that
get
we
1
can
hour
ramp
we
up
do.
when we need it.
That's correct.
Got it.
Okay.
Yes, and
Thank you.
I'm very glad that you both interrupted, and feel free. No, I am glad because, we go through these charts, and we've probably all seen them before, but I think we have to take the time to really understand them. And please feel free, if anyone has a question on a graph or a particular statement, that we go through it. The whole point of this is to get us to be able to think in a general way about these problems. We'll never be experts, but if we understand what the issues are through this, that's really where we want to be. So I'm glad so many of you are here. Go ahead, Phil.
Thank you. And I want to apologize, Mr. Chair, for not getting done in 10 minutes. But
Well, at this point, yeah, keep going. Frankly, you're
All right.
probably our most critical talk because you have a lot of the numbers.
All right.
So take your time.
So I do want to take a couple minutes and touch on the issue of regional. You've already heard about this with both of the previous speakers, and you may hear about that from other speakers coming up as well. But I wanted to take the opportunity to share with you from the ISO's perspective, why do we have a deeper regional coordination here? And first, I wanted to highlight the greenhouse gas benefits. The overgen that I shared with you that was happening on the 40% slide, the scatter plot, we've projected out that if we were able to take that energy and find load in the rest of the West, offset a gas unit in the rest of the WEC, that we would be able to have an additional 1.1 million tons of reduction in carbon emissions. If we take that same projection and go from 40 to 50%, there's an additional 1.5 million. Now, what I wanted to share with you is that total of 2.6 million metric tons of carbon emissions is pretty significant when the goal right now under CARB's scoping plan is for the energy sector, the electric sector, to reduce by 10 million metric tons by the year 2020. So certainly moving on, we've got an opportunity, if we can find load for this, to have an additional 2.6 million metric tons. Okay? How do we do it? Well, the ISO has already taken steps to try to do what we can under the current construct. And you heard mentioned by Dr. Hart about the energy imbalance market. The ISO started an energy balance market last year. And from this slide, you can see we have multiple entities projecting to come online later this year. In November is Nevada Energy Company. And by the end of next year, Puget Sound and also Arizona Public Service. What you've also heard, though, is the energy imbalance market really only works on the 5 and 15-minute intervals. So we're already into the operating day, and we really only have an opportunity to make the minor adjustments. There is an opportunity to do more. And PacifiCorp, who's currently in the energy imbalance market, has now announced their interest in joining the ISO formally. And what we mean by that is an opportunity for them to participate in the ISO's markets, just like the investor-owned utilities we have in the state today, PG&E, and you know you have Edison here today speaking. And more importantly, it takes us into the day-ahead market. So what are the benefits of participating in the ISO in the day-ahead market? Well, actually, before I do that, Mr. Chair, you asked a question about diversity. And I do want to try to address that real quickly here. First of all, I think by looking out through the rest of the Western footprint, 2 points. First of all, higher quality resources. We talk about wind in Wyoming as one option. wind in Wyoming, from what we understand, could have a capacity factor as much as 40%. In other words, running hours to help produce energy and serve load. The wind resources we have in California are substantially less than that. And if we look around the rest of the West, we've got an opportunity to see those renewables built that can actually provide higher value for the dollars that are spent to build them out. So quality is one factor. The second one is actually reducing operational risk. And I wanted to share with you that we've had at least 2 major events this year where because of monsoon cloud cover, it had a significant effect on the solar facilities that we have in the state of California. We've got almost 6,700 megawatts of solar installed on the grid today, but on July 1st, we had something just less than 3,000 megawatts of that solar was curtailed because of cloud cover. And on July 30th, it was almost 3,000 megawatts, or half of the installed capacity was curtailed. That meant we, the ISO, had to be able to find energy in that operating hour in order to be able to serve customer load in California. So by consolidating all the resources, we just run a greater risk that those kinds of impacts from Mother Nature are more severe. We can spread those out, we have less of an impact. So let me move to the last slide. And I wanted to just draw the contrast about what's really the difference between the spot market that's in the energy imbalance and what happens in a day-ahead market. And what I'm trying to highlight here for you is we already are using our state-of-the-art technology to support the energy imbalance. What this means is we operate today with PacifiCorp as if we're completely different balancing authorities. They have to start up their generators and project what their load is and be ready to meet national reliability criteria. And they do that separately from us in the day-ahead time frame. What happens is when we move into the operating hour, we come together and now operate as a single balancing authority. And to the extent we have low-cost energy to send to them, we're able to do that. And they have low-cost energy to send to us, we're able to receive that. In the first 3 quarters of this operating market, there's more than $20 million worth of savings by just making those small changes. What I wanted to highlight for you here is moving to the day-ahead market gives us an opportunity to now project what our renewable output's going to be in the next day and potentially not start generators either in California or in the PacifiCorp system. That takes us from a few megawatts in the real time to many megawatts in the day-ahead process. And finally, one of the things that happens is trying to optimize our transmission grid. Most parties throughout the West have transmission ownership, but also have transmission rights. Many of those transmission rights you need to call on in the day ahead or further forward in order to have access to that transmission capacity. If you didn't use it in the day ahead, those transmission rights actually are reduced. And that's really the circumstance we have with PacifiCorp. It's potentially 4 to 5 times more transmission will be made available to us with PacifiCorp being in our market in the day ahead than is currently available in the real time. So I'll stop there and see what other questions you might have.